Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Franklin. I'm a partner at White and Case in Houston. Um, I specialize in financing and development of energy projects. And I'm advised on LNG projects, export and import here in the Gulf Coast, in the Americas, in Europe, and also in Asia. I'm very excited to be working with our illustrious panel here today on this topical subject. We've been quite domestically focused up until now, so I think we're going to turn our attention to Texas's relationship with the rest of the world. I'm not sure if it's coincidence that I was asked to moderate this panel as the rest of the world, but look, this year's geopolitical situation has completely reopened thinking on energy security, energy transition in the world. And Texas gas and LNG really lies at the heart of this conversation. We've got a wonderful panel this afternoon to talk about this. David Brazil is the CEO of RBN Energy. Mark Merrill is President and CEO of Uniper North America. And Adam Prestige is Senior Vice President and Head of Legal and Corporate Affairs at Glenfarne Energy Transition. Emil Pena, unfortunately, is not able to join us today, but our three panelists will no doubt be adequately equipped to fill Emil's 25 minutes of time. So to start us off, panelists, can you just share us a little bit more of your backgrounds, but also give us a sort of quick download of your view of what you see as the current short to medium term outlook for global LNG and the role that Texas gas and LNG plays in all of this. Adam, why don't you kick us off, please?
Sure. Adam Prestige, good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be here with you. So I work at Glenfarne Energy Transition, and we are a infrastructure developer in our heart. So our firm started as a power generation developer in Latin America. And so the platform that we really built ourselves on is around renewable power generation, thermal gas power generation, and grid stability power generation in Latin America. By grid stability, I mean those are the diesel plants that are meant to fire only 1% of the time when the renewable grid is not functioning at its necessary capacity. The perspective that I bring today is that we, in addition to our LATAM business, are developing two LNG export projects on the US Gulf Coast. We have Texas LNG, which is a 4 million ton export facility in Brownsville, Texas. And we have Magnolia LNG, which is an 8.8 million ton export facility in Louisiana. Both projects are near FID. They're both fully FERC permitted and kind of late stage in their development, and really kind of on the cusp of moving forward. And we'll talk a lot about the current environment and why that's kind of enabled us to really accelerate our timelines. I'll say in the short term, I won't take too much time, but what we're really seeing in the short term is a dramatic change, dramatic upheaval of the supply and demand curves for LNG. And what we're coping with this year is a very dramatic readjustment for everyone, for not just developers like ourselves, but for customers, for governments who plan electricity grids and power grids. Really everyone who's got any exposure to energy and power, readjusting to the dramatic events of the year. So we'll be talking about that much more in depth.
Thank you, Mark Merrill, President and CEO of Uniper North America. Thank you very much also for the invite. It's great to be back at the University of Texas after being away for a while. I'm also a lawyer. Took this job 3 years ago here in Houston, after practicing law, heading up our legal and compliance department in Europe for 12 years. Uniper, for those of you who aren't aware, is a large European generator. We have 34 gigawatts of generation, mostly in Northwestern Europe and also Russia. We also have one of the largest gas portfolios, though, in Europe. And what we're known for right now is actually being Gazprom's largest customer. We import about 200, or used to import about 200 terawatt hours of gas every year from Russia, and because of that, we'll be soon nationalized by the German government. But why are we here? We're a big global company. We have a number of assets, but one of the things we do here in North America, in addition to trade power and natural gas, is we've been exporting gas out of Freeport since 2019. Hopefully, That will start up again this month if everything goes according to plan. We're also actively seeking spot cargoes and longer term other opportunities off the Gulf Coast because, really the reason the German government is taking us over is because we are so important to the security of supply in Europe and particularly in Germany. And that's what we're doing here in North America, particularly here down in Texas. Really, my organization brings that gas down to the Gulf Coast, down to Freeport, and the Germans pick it up and bring it, hopefully, right now, given the price signals and the issues to Europe. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I really do think Texas, obviously, and the Gulf Coast plays a huge role in the security supply, and it's really an opportunity for us as Americans to help our allies across the world and play a real critical role in this very difficult time that we're going through right now.
My name is David Brazil with RBN Energy. Currently inheriting the CEO job from another Brazil who founded RBN Energy. I work with Rick Smead and Sheetal Nasta, who are both here today. I assume everybody here knows Rick, so he's my ace in the hole. If you guys give me questions I can't answer, I'll turn to Rick. But Sheetal also knows more about gas than I ever will. What we do primarily is fundamental analysis based on oil, gas, natural gas liquids. So we span the gamut of hydrocarbons and slowly getting into renewable energies. Primarily what we do is, or what we're known for, is our blog goes out to 36,000 people. I think several people in the room have said that they read it. And really what that does is it drives in business for our consulting business. And that's where we really learn a lot about what's going on in the energy industry. And the reason that's important is because right now we see a lot of activity, and just about everything we do, even the things that are oil related or NGL related, all have a tie-in to Texas markets, because the Permian is the biggest thing going on in all three, and also LNG markets, because right now the investment appetite for LNG really is much higher than what we see in other sectors across oil and gas. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But from a Texas point of view, obviously the impact that we make on both LNG markets and supply markets is going to be large and increasing.
Great, thanks all. Okay, so I think the first area that I wanted to touch upon was Texas exports. So obvious place to start, but actually it's quite it ties in quite nicely to some of the earlier discussions we've heard, I think, because people have talked about infrastructure specifically and what some of the constraints of Texas infrastructure are on getting gas specifically from producers to market. We know Texas has got an abundance of gas. David, starting with you, from a sort of LNG export perspective, what are the main opportunities and challenges to exporting gas out of the US?
Right, and obviously we're going to focus on Texas, but the story is much bigger than Texas. So for example, right now, I think Todd mentioned we're producing something like 25 BCF a day of dry natural gas. Well, if you include New Mexico, which is a stone's throw away in the Permian, that's another 4.5 BCF a day. And likewise, when we talk about LNG, we're going to focus on what's going on in the Texas Gulf Coast, but really it's all centered right there around the Sabine River. So there's this huge crash of supply coming into the Gulf Coast. At the same time, you have a huge sucking sound of LNG demand coming out right at the Sabine River. So Port Arthur LNG, Golden Pass LNG, Sabine Pass, Cameron, Venture Global's new project. So there's, a massive amount of LNG capacity that's going to be coming online to soak up any additional gas that can get there, either from Texas or from adjacent supply markets. The challenge that we're seeing and that we're hearing from a lot of our clients is around timing. It's how can I make sure the gas is where it needs to be when it needs to be there. So for example, I think a lot of you guys know that Waha prices went negative a couple of days ago for the first time in a couple of years. And the reason for that was there were supply constraints for getting natural gas out of the Permian. Well, those supply constraints, they got alleviated. So prices are back into positive territory. But as we continue to grow natural gas production out in the Permian, and that production profile only looks to increase as we continue to drill more and more for crude oil out in the Permian, you're going to have new pipeline projects that are going to be looking for egress to get gas to the Gulf Coast. We anticipate that a new one's going to be needed in 2024 and another new one after that in 2028-ish. So roughly 2 BCF a day a pop for those. Where are they going to go? Well, one of them is going to be heading down to South Texas. Where's the second one going to go? Well, it ought to be going somewhere that can help feed LNG capacity. Otherwise, we're not going to have the gas in the right place, and it's going to disrupt markets kind of the way we've talked about so far this morning. Obviously, we're in Texas, so we have a little bit more of a conducive regulatory environment to get those pipelines built, but there are still going to be challenges, particularly as we start to move into East Texas and look to find ways across the Sabine River to have a back and forth between what's going on in Lake Charles and what's going to be going on in Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Houston.
Adam, something I think is really important to understand is export terminals. It's not easy. You can't just like click your fingers and make these things happen. They're huge capex undertakings. Can you perhaps give us a flavor of what it actually takes to get an export terminal built in the US, and particularly what prospects for capital raising are, because these are hugely capital
Sure.
projects, obviously.
So I would say before we even talk about what it takes to get a terminal built, let's just talk about what it takes to start construction on a terminal. So before you start construction, you have to reach final investment decision. And that's basically the moment where everything's lined up and you can take the construction loan funds and take the equipment out and start building the project. And I like to compare that event, the final investment decision, or FID, to trying to land 3 747s on an aircraft carrier at the same time. And those 3 747s are, one, you have to have commercial contracts that number in the tens of billions of dollars of life revenue. You need to have a huge amount of regulatory permitting at the local, state, and federal level. And then you need to have worked with a consortium of lending banks and convince them that everything is lined up on this project and that this project is a sure thing to return the multiple billions of dollars that they're going to loan you to build the project. And so each one of those elements has a lot of particular concerns, and the challenges of trying to land each one of those elements on the aircraft carrier at any given moment could be its own panel session. Specifically to talk about financing, what has changed this year and what the dynamic that we continue to try to track is that banks are becoming more and more reluctant about lending to the hydrocarbon industry. And LNG does seem to be kind of the, I'd say maybe the most acceptable form of hydrocarbons to lend to. But even as an LNG developer, we still need to be very cognizant of the fact that banks are reluctant to loan to hydrocarbons. And so the way that we do that and the way that we see other developers doing that is by really trying to differentiate the project design to take into account lower emission profiles. And so I can speak to our projects utilize a couple of different things. So we've got a project that runs on 100% renewable electricity instead of a gas powered motor. We have our Louisiana project uses 30% less gas to actually run the turbine, so it lowers emissions on site. And then you have a number of LNG projects that are being built with carbon capture design. And you're also seeing projects that are being built offshore, kind of different designs. Each of these, the question that I sometimes get is there a green premium? Are you seeing customers paying more for those low emission attributes? And I'd say the answer is a resounding no. And I think that's kind of uniform across LNG developers. Nobody's really showing up saying, we're willing to pay you X dollars more or X% more per MMBTU because you have lower emissions. What we're finding though, and what we believe is that those lower emission attributes are really table stakes for conversations with banks, for conversations with European off-takers. And it's really those kinds of attributes that you need to convince, especially your European banks, to join these consortiums of lenders and find that they are acceptable in ways that LNG really furthers the energy transition and has lower emissions on site. So that's kind of the distinct angle that we've taken towards banking lately.
Yeah, can I follow up on that real quick?
Oh, yeah,
I mean, because I think it's a really important point that, you know, obviously security of supply has replaced some of the ESG concerns that our European customers mostly had for now, but they haven't forgotten about it. And therefore, I think it's really important for the Texas projects, for the North American projects, to really focus on cleaning up the gas system, which I know we're doing, right? So whether it be certified gas, whether it be cleaning up the methane emissions from the pipelines, whether it be, you know, actually reducing emissions at the actual liquefaction facilities, that is going to be, they're going to come back around. And it's going to be very, very important for the acceptability of our product going forward. You know, these contracts, you know, the 20-year contract takes these investments, you know, past 2040, where a lot of us, both in North America, but particularly Europe, have made these net zero goals, right? And particularly certain governments are very concerned about that, you know, actually entering into long-term obligations that go beyond 2040. And therefore, it's very, very important that we as an industry do our part here to provide that transparency and clean their system up as much as we can to make that product the most acceptable as possible for our customers.
Mark, just sticking with you for a moment, the other you know, complexity and sort of unique feature of LNG in the energy sector is the fact that it needs to be transported on ships, and you know, getting these ships that can do that, it's an undertaking in itself. Where we stand today, how is the industry set up to manage LNG transportation and shipping for the short and medium term needs of places like Europe and Asia?
Well, it's pretty, you know, we have a shipping somewhat shortage, right? It takes a long time to build these things, to move them around the world and to order them. And not, you know, the speed of change has been extremely rapid, right? So there's definitely going to be a shortage for the near term on shipping capacity, but I think that's going to be resolved, right? Because there is a market for it. I think the more important thing is, I think we'll talk about in just, I think maybe the next question is the infrastructure that's needed, actually the long-term investment that's needed, particularly in Europe, to actually accept these volumes. And maybe we can talk about that now if you want. Yeah, I mean,
let's go in. So, I mean, as we said, exporting is only half the battle. I think the $1 trillion question is the infrastructure there in the downstream to sort of actually receive it. Mark, you know, as a representative of Uniper, you're perfectly placed to tell us about this. What is the current state of European LNG infrastructure and what additional investment is needed? We sort of hear all sorts of horror stories about how long it's actually going to take to get terminals up and running and all this sort of stuff. But we're really interested to hear your views on that.
Well, definitely throughout the summer, and even today, we're running at 100% capacity, right? So we need to expand that infrastructure as fast as possible. So I know in Europe, or in Germany in particular, Uniper itself, we've procured 2 FSRUs to put off the coast of Germany. Our peers have procured 3 more Accelerates, going to put one of their ships off the coast. And I know the Eastern Europeans are doing the same thing. That's the quickest sort of thing we can do right now, is to get those floating vessels over there. But we're also at Wilhelmshaven going to start. We're going to actually already started construction this year to put a permanent facility at Wilhelmshaven. There's going to be another Brunsbüttel. There's going to be another in Stade in Germany. So we are building infrastructure as fast as we can. I mean, we talk about, you know, across the Western world, permitting is a general complaint of our industry, right? How long it takes to actually get something built. The speed at which, and in Germany, trust me, if you know Germans, they like bureaucracy just like everyone else. But the speed at which they got these projects approved has been really amazing. And you can't forget that the energy minister and the foreign minister are both the joint heads of the Green Party. The pragmatism with which they've shown, you know, flying around the world with us to try to procure LNG from different places, including, you know, obviously in the United States. You know, how many times we visited the US Embassy in Berlin and talked about that. The pragmatism with which they're going about trying to get this infrastructure in place. I mean, I think they recognize, I don't speak for the German government on this point. I don't speak for Uniper. I think they recognize the mistake they made with the lack of diversification, but they really are trying to fix that, right? With their storage levels, they're getting the gas storage levels up now today in Germany is at 97%. They turned the coal plants back on. They're doing everything possible to get that infrastructure built to be able to get their security of supply again and diversify away from their, call it, historical sources of energy. But it's going to take, like I said, these commitments. And one of the things you do see hesitancy by the German government is because, look, you're entering into on a commitment that takes them into the 2040s, and they don't sort of want to think about that. Or when they do, we're doing something, for example, at Wilhelmshaven, which is also, I think, a really huge opportunity. The previous speaker talked about, I think a couple of people mentioned it, actually the hydrogen development off the Gulf Coast, and then the ammonia export potentially. So our Wilhelmshaven, we're going to start importing LNG, but then be able to also take ammonia, hopefully from the Gulf Coast as well, in a few years when that market's up and running. So yeah, a lot of investments needed, a lot of political will is needed, but I think both the money and the will is there right now.
So on the money point, and it's obviously got companies like Uniper that are now becoming nationalized as one important source of capital. David, I wondered if you could share some of your thoughts about where else this investment is going to come from, particularly for example, Eastern Europe, which is a major portion of the European population, completely dependent on vast areas of it are completely dependent on, or have been completely dependent on Russian gas. But just generally, where do you see this money coming from that needs to be poured in to fund all this investment? And again, I think interesting to know in the European context, particularly Adam was talking about how important ESG was to financing export in the US. European banks and institutional investors have famously been extremely focused on ESG matters. Are you seeing this sort of being recalibrated a bit on the downstream side?
So just to clarify, we get onto the water and my knowledge evaporates. So these guys will know far more about what's going on overseas than I will. Speaking from a domestic perspective, we first started really getting the message from our company, our customers back in 2019 that that ESG was the thing that they had to be paying attention to. Obviously, those calls for increased responsibility built up very much over the next couple of years, to the point where there weren't new projects that were getting funded in the US unless they had a green story to them. There were lots of headlines at the time where institutional investors were telling their funds, hey, look, we don't want to be in fossil fuels. You had statements by folks like BlackRock saying, hey, we're going to be pulling out of fossil fuels. I feel like with the energy crisis, the pendulum has swung back a little bit the other way to focus more on energy security. So there still is a strong push for RSG, LFG, all of the other acronyms for responsibly sourced natural gas. But the focus has been more economic. That's been the primary driver into this space from our point of view. Now, to the extent that LNG serves as a bridge fuel or a cleaner alternative to what other developing countries would be burning otherwise if they did not have enough LNG. Yeah, I think there's a lot of international appetite for increased LNG exports.
Thanks, David. I'm conscious that we've been talking quite a lot about Europe and not about Texas gas specifically over the last sort of 5 minutes or so. But before we sort of swing back to Texas, Adam, the talk of the town at the moment is about Europe, but until this year, it was the Pacific region that tended to be the largest LNG market, and there's definitely still a lot of exciting stuff going on or in the pipeline, no pun intended, for sort of downstream LNG in Asia. Can can you give us a sort of flavor of what's going on in Asia at the moment and how it compares to the situation in Europe today?
Sure. So I think there's a tendency, and I'm guilty of this too, of kind of referring to two different markets. There's Europe and there's Asia. And what's happened this year is that all the LNG that was headed to Asia has gone to Europe. That's obviously a dramatic oversimplification. So I want to make sure that we're kind of clarifying two different markets in Asia. You have Japan, China, and Korea, which historically have been the largest importers of LNG in the world and continue to really lead the pace. And then you have kind of the emerging market Asia, your Vietnam, Bangladesh, Thailand, which were prior to the events of this year, really up and coming as potential LNG importers. And so if we took this back, if we took kind of LNG export conversations and LNG marketing business development conversations for US exporters back a year and said, where was the focus? It was dramatically focused on Southeast Asia and those emerging markets. Vietnam, for example, I think every LNG export developer, every marketer, was jumping into Vietnam, looking at this dramatic growth in these emerging markets and how can we be a part of that. It's all stopped. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not quite that dramatic, but just the degree of conversation and demand for those emerging Asian markets has just shut down to a very serious degree. And that's really a result of, when you commission 5 import terminals in Germany overnight, that has an impact on the market and drives prices up. And what an unfortunate result of all of this is a slowing of the energy transition and the decarbonization of those markets in Asia. So when LNG prices go up because cargoes are being diverted to Europe, the Vietnamese, the Thais, the Pakistanis, they burn more coal, and they don't just burn more coal, but they commission and start building new coal power plants. And we've seen, unfortunately, firsthand experience of plans to build new LNG import terminals and LNG power plants scrapped in exchange for building new coal plants. And so as a LNG terminal developer, I'm not a fan of those decisions, but that's what we're seeing. So that's kind of the emerging market side on Asia. On the more developed side, what we are seeing is the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans, but especially the Chinese, continuing to be very strong buyers. And so while understandably, the Europeans have been assessing the market and trying to figure out how do we structure deals, and do we buy on Henry Hub or TTF? Do we buy 15, 20, 10 years? The Chinese have just been signing kind of the classic LNG deals, which are 20 years, Henry Hub, low prices. And so those are the types of conversations that we've seen happening this year. Yeah.
So just touching on the effect of the high natural gas prices globally, from an LNG developer's perspective, all of a sudden now you have a whole lot more appetite for the types of sales and purchase agreements that ultimately get you to a final investment decision for the new LNG development. So from their perspective, and I'm not trying to put words in y'all's mouth, but from an LNG developer's perspective, there's a whole lot more people who are interested in getting into the LNG game than there are, say, back in 2020 when we had massive cargo cancellations. So nowadays, if you have a project and you have a pulse, you've got people ringing you up trying to sign a deal. The flip side of that, and I'm not going to take credit for this quote, is that Europe has essentially exported their problem to the rest of the developing world. What I mean by that is they are able to pay high prices and subsidize the natural gas that's going to, end up going into Germany and other places in Europe. It's the places like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India that have trouble making those $100 spot payments for LNG, and they're the ones that really take it on the chin when prices are this high.
I know you didn't mean to say it that way, but the problem was created by Russia, right? So Europe didn't export. I mean, unfortunately, we all saw that happen, right? We knew that was going to happen, that if supplies were cut off to Europe, it wasn't, we can pay for it in the United States, Europe can pay for it, Asia can pay for it, but the global South can't, right? And it's going to cause huge energy shortages and also food shortages. I mean, it's a really, really big problem. And it's continued. We've been saved essentially by, COVID lockdowns in China because the demand wasn't there and we were able to compete. But, if China's economy picks back up again, it's hopefully we're ready for that to happen, because that'll be very difficult times for energy prices in the world.
Yeah, and obviously there's been, like I said, this sort of reawakening to the importance of energy security for everything that we do, whether it's, lights, transportation, or food production. That said, the writing was on the wall and the prices were shooting up before Russia invaded. And I'm not, I'm not trying to pick a fight. Maybe I am. Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
You tell me.
But
I can tell you exactly when the prices went up, and I can point to a couple of reasons why it went up.
we need to get some graphs out here. But the intent of a lot of the policies that stemmed out of the Paris climate agreements were to increase fossil fuel prices to encourage development of renewables. And they were effective just a lot faster than anybody hoped.
Correct. That's a good point.
So, okay, let's bring us back there to Texas. It's clearly a very sort of dynamic moment for LNG pricing in the world. What if all this stuff gets built, both on the export side and the demand side, and energy continues to the market continues to expand? What kind of pressure is this going to put on US domestic gas prices? And what does that do to the domestic market and also the wider global gas and LNG market?
Right. Well, obviously, giant increases in demand are obviously going to have upward pressure on natural gas prices. With Cove Point online, we are now at 12 BCF a day of feed gas out of the 100 BCF a day that we produce. When Freeport comes back online next month, we're going to be at 14. And what we was when Freeport had their explosion, natural gas prices went down. As those demands come back up, we're going to expect to see gas prices rise. There are way too many things going on geopolitically and internationally to try and forecast where exactly those prices will land, but the general consensus is up. We are currently somewhat insulated from global natural gas prices by the limitation, which is capacity. To the extent that we continue to increase capacity, we're going to be more exposed to international prices. And the flip side of that is the international market is going to have the benefit of US natural gas. So how much could there be? Well, it depends on what you think about supply and demand. There are each basin that produces natural gas has unique economics, right? So Permian is primarily a oil production basin. Its economics are driven by oil. The gas that's produced there is largely associated. So it's going to be, that gas is going to come. It's going to be a supply push. It's going to push natural gas pipelines out to be able to not suffer huge basis discounts at Waha, because there's no appetite for flaring like there used to be 5-10 years ago. It's not the same in places like the Haynesville or the Marcellus and Utica. The Haynesville is primarily a dry natural gas play. So as prices rise, it's going to incentivize increased production from that basin. And you can see a lot of producers and midstreamers really gearing up for increased production out of the Texas and Louisiana sides of the Haynesville. There have been several new gas pipeline projects aimed at bringing gas from the north to the south to be able to supply the LNG. But we're kind of fighting with one hand tied behind our back, because our most prolific natural gas basin is not going to have any incremental production to help alleviate the supply constraints. And that's because we can't build new pipelines out of Appalachia. MVP is hung up behind permitting reviews. And I don't know how deep we want to go into it. Sheetal here is our expert on MVP. But Joe Manchin wants to get that pipeline built. It'd allow additional 2 BCF a day to get down to the Gulf Coast. That would be obviously positive for the US supply demand balance, helpful for natural gas prices. but it keeps getting hung up in the, what is it, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals on challenge after challenge, and they can't get over the hump despite being very, very close to completion by all accounts. They can't build it. So the production is going to have to come from associated gas basins like the Permian, dry natural gas basins like the Haynesville, and we're starting to see a lot of incremental response from the secondary basins like the Eagle Ford, Anadarko, other places where infrastructure can get built to get down to the Gulf Coast to help alleviate some of the constraints. So again, it's a complicated answer.
I think this is a really crucial thing that we should keep an eye on over the next few years. It's interesting. There was an article in the major German newspaper, business newspaper, about the governor of Georgia and the governor of Oklahoma taking a tour around Germany, trying to get German businesses and industrial base to move to Oklahoma and Georgia, and some of the tax subsidies. There has been, we all know this over the last year. The reason Texas has been so successful, or one of the reasons Texas has been so successful, is because of the cheap energy that we have here in the region. Everybody knows that in the world now, and it's locking a lot of European companies down here because of the cheap energy. The risk we run, and we've already heard, some cry. I don't think people will get too loud about it now, given the national security interests around exporting LNG. But if our domestic prices rise too much, I think you'll hear more and more calls for limiting the export of LNG. I think you already see it. I think I heard something up in New England just recently. So I think we should all keep an eye on that, because there is a real risk that the domestic industrial base starts to get active in Washington and try to limit the export of LNG to keep a cap on prices here domestically.
Adam, how does all this play into the long-term future for LNG in Europe and Asia coming out of the US, and particularly sort of the current tensions that you talked about in terms of high prices in Europe, dampening demand in at least developing Asia?
I think we'll continue to see it. I think it's kind of obvious based on the comments here that unless there is dramatic change to US regulatory regime, we'll see LNG exports going to Europe and Asia for a very long time. And we'll see those under the current contracts that are getting signed for 15 to 20 years, and we'll see it beyond that. And one of the things that I think we will have to look ahead to will be moving cargo, redirecting cargoes based on policy decisions in those destination markets. And so some of our conversations that we're having with European customers and European governments are around an acceptance for contracts of 15 to 20 year length, but with a recognition that as European markets pursue net zero goals and zero carbon goals, there will be a need to basically reject cargoes from taking them into Europe and send them elsewhere to places that are, frankly, less advanced on their energy transition. And so I think we continue to see strong exports on the long term.
Thanks, everybody. I think we've touched upon this topic all the way through our conversation, but it's just a great way to finish this panel off, because it's key to every energy conversation at the moment, and that is on energy transition. It's clearly Texas gas and LNG has a long and central role to play in energy transition in the future. But I guess the questions that, and this comes back to Mark's point about people's short-term memories and all this kind of stuff, and the view particularly of financiers as to where gas, how bankable and acceptable financing gas projects was from a policy perspective. Getting us beyond this immediate acute period of need, how does Texas gas and LNG maintain and reinforce its position as a clean fuel in the ongoing energy transition that enables it to sort of stay in the game, basically, alongside renewables and other forms of clean energy. Who wants to start?
Maybe I'll start with that. So one way of looking at that is that there will also always be, or almost always will be, a need for baseload, reliable fuel, reliable power. And so some of our projections so we're a developer of renewable power and of LNG and gas-fired power. And our belief internally as a company is that we need for every 1 gigawatt of renewable power generation that runs, on peak capacity to service a grid, you need an additional 1 gigawatt of backup power from a fossil fuel plant, basically, that can run any percentage of the time when the renewable power isn't running. And so we think that will continue to require fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, LNG for the energy transition for the long term. That it's just a matter of fact that at certain times the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And when that happens, you're going to need a very responsive power source that can fill those gaps. In kind of a different perspective, I think in the long term, we're also going to see a continuing need for a focus on ESG and a focus on addressing local emissions and local issues for LNG projects. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of our time with as developers is thinking about how do our projects impact local communities, both in terms of actual air emissions, but also jobs, local investment, and things like that. And so I think continuing to focus on those communities and those relations and kind of the government relations are going to be an important part of keeping LNG in the mix long term.
You can jump in there if you want.
No.
Yeah, I'd echo what you said. I'd also say that taking a global view of the energy landscape is going to be crucial, right? We produce natural gas and LNG as cleanly as anywhere in the world, and obviously with the new methane taxes at $17 or $20 per MMBTU, depending on who you ask, it's going to continue. We're going to continue to clean up our act, and what we're producing, the gas, the LNG, the quality of life improvements that we're able to export to other parts of the world long term, and in order to reach decarbonization goals, really can't be understated. So if there's an argument to be made, of course, that methane is a more intense global warming potential gas than CO2, and that's a valid critique. At the same time, what we're replacing is coal and wood and people burning dung in their houses, the quality of life improvements that we are able to facilitate in developing countries is just massive. And if you look at the increase in energy that we're going to need and how countries are currently planning to develop it, I think you mentioned all of the new planned coal facilities in India and places where they've been priced out of natural gas. It's really a shame. There have been, figures quoted. I saw Toby Rice speak last week, and he said, the amount of emissions coming from coal that we've basically backtracked on in the last couple of months since this war has started has basically undone everything we've done decarbonization up to this point. I haven't checked that statistic, but it sure caught my attention. And it has the ring of truth that, look, we can make incremental gains with renewables and hydrogen. And I'm a big fan of all of that stuff if done in a logical way, without overextending and overinvesting and over-incentivizing things that don't make sense. But we have a very clean opportunity, a very good decarbonization opportunity right at our fingertips.
Well said. That really is the point I wanted to make. I think gas is going to be here for a long time, right? We just need to continue to be transparent about what we're doing, to continue to improve as much as we can, to clean up the processes. but also to tell the story of what it actually, the benefits it does bring to the world, right? And exactly what you said. I mean, the people in India, in Pakistan, Pakistan wanted to convert their entire economy to a gas economy, right? And that got all sidetracked in the last few months, and that's a real shame. But we'll get back to it, and I think if we continue to be pragmatic and tell a good story, I think it'll be successful.
One more thing. So a big issue that we've raised throughout today, and is probably the biggest issue going on right now within the industry, is the issue around permitting. And we touched on it. We touched on MVP and Mansion, but just wanted to point out, it's such a bipartisan issue to get permitting reform done. It's not just about oil and gas, it's about transmission lines. And so you really have both, left and right, greenies and industry guys agreeing on permitting reform. And no matter which way we decide to go, if it's electrification or building the new natural gas pipelines, it's something that has to happen. So I guess that's my parting thought. If we were going to try to export our energy abundance to the rest of the world, it pretty much starts there.
Great, thanks, guys. Well, look, we've still got a bit of time, I think. I don't know whether people have questions that they want to ask our panel. Rick.
Jamie, I guess a question for Mark. In general, the internal European infrastructure beyond just the gasification, but basically the whole pipeline network was built quite from east to west. What are the issues there in getting it all built out properly?
Some of those can be reverse flow, but you're very correct. I mean, the entire infrastructure, not only the pipelines, but the storage facilities, it was always built with that direction. But that's an issue. So, I mean, I think they're working on it right now. There's a new pipeline between France and Germany. So France will be importing gas to Germany. And then the same from Spain, where they have some of that import capacity up into Central Europe. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have to restructure their entire energy system, both from a market design perspective, which we're very much involved in, but also from an infrastructure perspective.
The main question is this what could make the EU work?
Or not, right? That's the problem. I mean, you get a philosophical. I mean, one of the things is I've always found extremely interesting about our industry is how important it is, right? And you see that today, and it really is. Energy is at the central, particularly in Europe right now, at the central core of the problems. You see how certainly the Russians thought it was important enough to actually use it as a weapon, because you can see it can fray the entire society potentially. But I'm an optimist on that one. I think, yeah, it will bring people together.
Rick, my thought there, I have heard the opposite, that this could be what really causes the EU to fracture a little bit. And I think the reason I say that is when you see what's kind of the action that's been taken, it's been where there has been action to solve this problem, it's been on kind of a unilateral basis. And so you have the German import terminals being commissioned, by the German government. Obviously, you have Estonia building import terminal, and Finland building import terminals. Everybody's kind of trying to solve this problem by themselves. And at the same time, you have the EU Energy Commission, or the European Commission, throwing out a lot of, I don't mean this pejoratively, but putting up for consideration a lot of different theories, EU focused LNG pricing, joint purchasing platforms, natural gas price caps. And so this is 9, 10, 11 months post Russian invasion. And we see the EU kind of still trying to make a bunch of these kind of very high level decisions and really not coming close to much consensus, where the real decision that's been taken has been on unilateral action. So I'll avoid of European politics beyond that.
Bob G.
Yeah, continuing the conversation along the same theme, I had the honor last month of moderating a panel for the Energy Law Journal. I don't know if some people here might have seen that. We had some foreign policy and technical experts on the gas issue in the Russo-Ukrainian war. and they were speculating on the possibility of ultimately Russia and Ukraine coming to terms on some type of either armistice or peace agreement at some point in the future, whenever that may occur, and what would happen at that point relative to Russia resuming some form of role as supplier to Western Europe. One of our speakers was a former ambassador from Hungary to the United States and to NATO. And this may touch on a sensitive subject, so please bear with me. He was of the view that he could very well see German companies resuming takes of Russian gas under that scenario, that there would be little hesitation. I guess the question I put to all three of you is, have the commercial entities factored in that type of scenario in their long-term planning? Or is there, at least for now, an expectation that some form of armed conflict is going to persist for the foreseeable future?
I say from my perspective, developing business and really considering where we spend our resources and our efforts to try to secure offtake contracts, that question has come into mind, but it's so distant and so uncertain that I would say that I wouldn't call it really a factor in how we plan. It's kind of a recognition, like, before we go all in on XYZ, we should all recognize that there's a chance that this dynamic might change, but that's kind of just the natural way of, any kind of political dynamic. I think beyond that, it's highly speculative, other than to say there is a lot of gas in Russia. There is proven reliable infrastructure, and how long it stays unutilized, nobody can say.
That's the question I always get, and that's the one I'm not allowed to answer per my comms team. But what I will say, just besides that, I'm very close to the German industry, right? And the generation or two ahead of me, you have to understand, like, their whole view was this Ostpolitik, this Handel der Wandel, so this facing, it really was you see it in them all, and they honestly are very. They recognize, I think, the issue that they created. What I will say is, if you talk to a lot of people there, they talk about whether it's needed or not, and how long a certain amount of gas would be needed from Russia. And I'm not an expert on that, but what I can say with full certainty, never again will Europe or Germany be so dependent and enter into that kind of dependency. Diversification is the lesson I think everybody has learned. So we'll see. Hopefully, look, I hope the conflict is over tomorrow, right? But I can tell you that the trust has been broken, and I don't think it will be easily fixed for a long, long time.
Yeah, and geopolitics is not where we endeavor to spend our time, but yeah, it's a good question. How does the breaking of that relationship, that economic relationship, affect their willingness to come to some sort of agreement with Ukraine? I think it's a dicey question.
Great question, and I really appreciate the panel handling that one, because it's obviously a sensitive topic. So, any other questions?
We talked a lot about Europe, but what about the UK? They have their own gas shortage. Have they stepped up any LNG import capacity, or how are they preparing for this coming winter?
Either you or Adam?
So they do have, the Qataris, I believe, have an import facility off the coast of yeah. And they've also reopened Rough Storage, which is the largest storage facility that they had shut down only a couple of years ago. But just like the Europeans, the UK is actually from a retail perspective, they're the customers that have felt it first in their pockets. And there's a lot of suffering. It's amazing. I think a pensioner in the UK lives off like £10,000 a year, and their energy bills are going up by hundreds and almost thousands of pounds, right? So it's really, there's a lot of pain there. So they've been very active, trying to cushion that a little bit on the retail perspective. But the same way that everybody else is trying to secure their own supplies. There's been a lot of talk, talking about the fraying, about cutting off the interconnector and cutting off the connections between them and the mainland. So I think they'll also get through. I think from a European perspective and a German perspective, I think we'll get through this winter, particularly if the mild weather. When I got off the plane on Sunday in Houston, it was actually colder in Houston than it was in Frankfurt when I got on the plane 10 hours earlier. So they've had a really mild winter so far. And with storage levels where they are, there's a 50-50 chance that they get through to March without having to curtail. And I think that's pretty much the same throughout Europe, including the UK. So
I'll just add, I mean, I think you probably ask because you realize that the UK uses the least amount of Russian gas of, I think, most of the European countries, but they're still balancing how to arrange supply for the long term for the country. And so I think we've seen a couple of different, kind of reflective of the overall approach in Europe, where, for example, we saw Prime Minister Truss revert the ban on fracking, and then a week later, Prime Minister Sunak reinstated the ban on domestic fracking. And so I think just typical of everyone in that market, exploring a lot of different solutions.
I have next to nothing to add to the UK bit of the discussion, except to point out how it highlights the regulatory uncertainty. I remember the day after fracking got unbanned in the UK, we got the question of, would people actually move in and start fracking in the UK? And we said, no, they'd be crazy. They'd be absolutely insane, because it's going to get banned the moment the problem is gone. And it actually took a lot less time than that.
and I don't know if we should be taking, the UK government as an example of sort of stability right now, right? But on the fracking issue, I was at breakfast with some Bavarian politicians from Munich, and they actually asked for an extra hour and we brought in an expert from the industry to talk about fracking because they're interested in potentially doing it in Germany, which I don't think really will happen. But more importantly, they wanted to understand fracking is a big issue, and they understand there's article after article about them importing frack gas from the United States, and that they find that disturbing until you get an expert in front of them and actually talk about what it really, how it's not really that bad, right? That there's earthquakes aren't caused by fracking necessarily. There's never been water contamination. And hopefully that messaging, that's what I'm talking about. If we continually message correctly, there'll be the acceptance will increase.
That's it. Well, I think we're at our hour.